Hello and welcome to this very special show. I'm going to be talking about lessons on boldness, and who better than Raghu Raman. And to briefly tell you who he is, he's a soldier, CEO and a bureaucrat, all wrapped into one. Thank you so much for joining us on ET Now.
Thank you.
I want to pull back a little bit and take you back to your army life, right? Because a lot of us know it very in a very flaky manner, right? We don't really know what the army does and how important it is for us, because I think we just take it for granted most of the times, right? We just live in our lovely cocoon. So if you could, dip into those experiences and maybe some examples, some anecdotes, and bring to the fore how they do things and what we can learn from the army, because they're so disciplined, they're so regimented, and they're so focused. How we could implement that in, let's say, corporate life. And of course, also, pushing the boundary.
Firstly, of course, there is, you're right, absolutely. I think we belong to that nation, ironically and sadly, which does not know enough about its own army. Many times when I do, workshops in B schools, I ask these young kids, this army of yours, they do these amazing sacrifices and they put their life in line, and why do you think they do it? Why do you think soldiers fight? And invariably the answers I get from these kids is they do it for patriotism, the national flag, they do it for us. And then I put the map of India and I ask them, okay, fine, if you think they're doing it for you, so tell me, where is Siachen Glacier? Where is Kargil? And the same kids who can tell you where San Jose is, San Francisco is, they can't tell you where Siachen is. Matter of fact, most of them can't even tell which is north, Manipur, Meghalaya or Mizoram. They don't know their own geography. So I think that is sad for a country that they have no idea what their nation's army is doing for them, because like I said, you can't 1.2 billion people can't outsource patriotism to 1.2 million people. It's not going to happen that way. And if you want to truly become a superpower doesn't come from having just an army. It comes from having that sense of national pride. It comes from a sense of knowing your own nation. There are a lot of things that the army can tell, and this is not necessarily just the Indian army, because at the end of the day, what are you doing right now? You are in a business where you are more contenders fighting for less resources, and that is the definition of war. More contenders fighting for less resources. That's the definition of TV, that's the definition of advertising, that's the definition of any business.
Sure.
The reason of existence of a business, the reason of existence of leadership, teams, efficiency, operations is because there are less resources and more contenders. So you might as well learn from lessons that have been paid for and learnt in blood. And why would you want to learn it from a B school when you can actually go to the source from where most B schools draw their lessons, whether it's in operations, logistics, leadership in adversity, pushing the envelope. I think there is no better cradle of knowledge. There are many examples I can give you which I have taken, which I have been sort of groomed in. And I remember as a young second lieutenant, I was commissioned into a unit which was operating in Punjab, and this was the days when Punjab wasn't, it was going through the terrorist problems. And this is an example that I'm sure you can correlate with in your profession. Most people will be able to correlate. And the orders those days were, when we were traveling in a jeep, the orders were that the officer was sitting in the front, and mostly in the army, the driver is driving and the officer is sitting in the front. And the orders were that the officer has to carry an AK-47 or an assault weapon all the time in his hand, because you don't know when you will be ambushed and you needed to be able to react immediately.
Sure.
Now this weapon is a heavy thing, and you're traveling in Punjab and nothing is happening, and you kind of get lazy about it. And so one day I told my JCO, my junior commissioned officer, I said ki saab ye hatiyar ko piche rakh do. And he didn't move, and he just looked at me and he said, Saab, orders are for you to keep it with you. I said, yeah, but when are you going to use it? I mean, you may not, I've been here for 6 months and we hardly ever require it. And he taught me a very important lesson that day. He said that if you don't need to use it, you may not need to use it for weeks. You may not need to use it for months. But when you need to use it, you need to use it right then and there. That time you can't say, ki saab mere ko hatiyar do. And that's a very important lesson in leadership, in operations, in any. You have to be constantly prepared. And I see many youngsters when they come to office sometimes, and I'm being conscious about the different cultures of different organizations. They are unshaven, they are not dressed properly, because they dress only properly when they meet a client, or they put on a tie when they go to make a pitch. But you don't know when life will pitch to you. You can't dictate when life will pitch to you. And on that day when life pitches to you, if you're unshaven without a tie, that's that one moment.
Wow.
Where you might lose it.
Sure.
And it's not just operational disciplines. Sometimes they're life philosophies also. Let me give you a story there. So I'm a missile pilot. I used to be in the army where we were trained to fire thousands and thousands of missiles on simulators before we were given our first live missile.
Wow.
And this field firing was happening in a place called Ahmednagar, and there was a friend of mine who was also a missile pilot. And and this is a big day because you've been training for about 8-9 months, and at the end of 8-9 months they make selections, and finally a small selected bunch makes it to the next level and the next level, and finally you get a live missile to fire.
Sure.
And if the live missile hits the target, then you are given a missile badge that you wear on your chest, and you are known as a missile pilot, and that's a great coveted honor. So we lined up and we loaded up the missiles, and we were ready to fire, and then the command center told us, okay, tank 1 fire, tank 2 fire, tank 3 fire, and my friend was in the 4th BMP, it's a light tank. And when the orders came to fire, he pressed the trigger and the missile misfired. Now, what that means is that the missile didn't take off. It's a technical failure.
Sure.
Happens once in maybe 10,000 missiles. It sometimes happens.
Okay.
Sometimes you're doing an interview and your camera fails at that Murphy's Law, and it failed. And this person was so disappointed because if the missile had fired and he didn't hit it, understandable. But the missile didn't even take off, and he was so sad about it that when we went in front of the commandant, and the 3 of us were very proud that our missile hit, and the 4th one missile didn't even take off, and he had such a long face that the commandant felt sorry for him, and he looked at him and he said, okay son, here's what I'm going to do. From my pool, the commandant's pool, I'm going to give you 1 more missile. So my friend is again happy, and he gets the 2nd missile, he loads it up into the launcher, everything is ready. Now there's just one target, and he's going for the final test, and he presses the trigger, and the 2nd missile fails.
What?
Yes, the 2nd missile fails. Now, one gunner firing 2 missiles and both failing, it's a chance 1 in a million.
Sure.
And now this man has such a long face that, I mean, it's like all the gods have conspired against him on that day.
Yeah, sure.
And when he is walking away, our instructor, Ustad, 3 Fiti wala, Havaldar, he taps him on the shoulder and tells my friend and teaches him this very, very important lesson. He tells him that in life, all of us have some missiles which will misfire. Your misfires happened in training, not in live combat. So your 2 missiles which were supposed to misfire in your life happened in circumstances where everything was okay. Look at it from that perspective and not from a perspective of being sad. And I think that's a very important lesson, because many times we have disappointments in what we have tried to achieve. We fail in getting what we wanted. We fail in objectives, whether they are professional, sometimes personal. But we also realize some of our greatest happinesses have actually originated from a failure in the past. If that hadn't failed, if you hadn't broken there, if that thing that you had didn't break, you won't have what you have right now, because this happiness, the origin lies in some sadness. And I think these philosophical lessons, as you start learning, I mean, they go into your head. You may not learn them in some PowerPoint presentation, but they start getting instilled into you. And I think that's a very important aspect about the army training.
Given your experience and your knowledge and insights into terrorism and security issues, give me a sense, and if you could simplify it for the viewers as well, in terms of what's really happening in the world today, and where does India stand if you juxtapose India and the rest of the world in terms of just terrorism and the flavors of terrorism we're seeing. What exactly do we make of it?
I think firstly we need to understand the many flavors of terrorism, because for most people who are uninitiated in this space, they think terrorism is only some bomb exploding, or terrorism is some people storming a school and killing people. That is a form of terrorism. And terrorism is nothing but a sort of a weapon of war, and it's usually a weapon of war of the weaker side, because a smaller size of people, when they are able to exert compellence far beyond their size, that is achieved through this tool of terrorism. So if we understand that well, then we'll realize that the instances of terrorism are the manifestation of the last piece. So terrorism is not a sort of an instance, it is a cycle. And all terrorist organizations, they end, eventually they end. I mean, it may seem like a contradiction, but every terrorist movement in the world, if you go back historically, finally ends. It ends in one of the 6 ways. I mean, there are many ways in which it ends. It may become legitimate, like what happened in Nepal, that the Maoists, the Naxals eventually came into the government, or it may, like Ireland, where they may give up terrorism and sign an accord. It may end because one generation is not able to pass on the same fervor to the next generation,
Sure.
like the Khalistan movement, that ended there. It may end because of decimation of the terrorist group like Sri Lanka. But every one of them has an ending. I think the important point is to realize that each one of these movements is a different DNA. And if you can understand that DNA, I know a lot of people spend time in looking at the origin of that movement.
Okay.
Not enough people spend time in looking towards the end game of that movement. So we treat all terror movements in the same sort of light and boots and fences and guns and uniforms. But that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is, how can you nudge this particular movement and make this movement topple over in its natural decline, and how can you accelerate that? And that requires a different kind of thinking. It's not a force to force sort of contest. It is a force to intellect.
I'd like you to, just dip into your reservoir of experience and memories and tell me about how the army has, reinvented, is quite creative with the way it actually communicates to the external world and its stakeholders, given the fact that, they're so isolated and they're doing their own thing, they're doing the most important thing, but, not so much dialogue or communication is happening.
I agree that the army doesn't communicate, and that is traditional of our army. We don't. We like to maintain a distance from the media and all of that, and there are reasons for it, and
sure.
I think they're legitimate reasons.
Sure.
But we reach out to the community and stakeholders who are very important to us. So, firstly, the most important stakeholders to us are our own troops. How do you take men into battle without ESOP, pay hike, employee of the month, or any material benefit, right? So unless you are able to communicate to them a larger than life purpose, unless you are able to communicate. So when you walk into so I'll give you a story about, let's say you walk into an officer's mess of the 1st Sikh regiment. It's a 1st Sikh battalion of the Sikh regiment. And when you enter the mess, they'll take you to a small parchment of paper. It's typewritten paper, and gray, it's almost yellowing, and it's in tatters, and you can see those typewriter holes in it. And they are the op orders issued in October 1947. And it says that tomorrow morning, 2 companies of this battalion will report to Palam Airport, and the mission will be given to you in Palam Airport. And this were the 2 companies which were airlifted to Srinagar to protect Kashmir. It was this action which ensured that Kashmir is in the map of India. Now when it begins with that narrative, and then you're taken to the next trophy, you're told this trophy was given to us when we captured so-and-so place. This flag, to recover this flag, we lost 13 soldiers, but we did not let the flag back. And story after story after, you feel you're standing in a temple. You feel that there is no way that you can disgrace the ghosts of your past warriors who are looking down on you, and who expect you to carry the heritage and the legacy of that name of that battalion ahead. So we know how to communicate. We, at the end of the day, get people to jump on grenades.
Sure,
so
of course.
we better know how to communicate,
of
right?
Course.
The challenge really is, I think, in today's age, how do we communicate better to a completely different audience? And how do we communicate in an age where the storytelling has to be compressed,
sure.
where mind share is getting so, I mean, in your business, it's so obvious that unless you are
there's ADD everywhere.
It is, that's happening. And I think there is a case to be made to reducing the size of communication, but there's also a case to be made that truly in-depth knowledge cannot be done in 140 characters.
Yeah, that's true.
Today we have a lot of what I call well-informed idiots, because they skim a few pages and they are suddenly experts on the subject.
Absolutely.
And I think there is this curve which goes down has to stop at some point, and people have to realize that when you are talking about truly meaningful things, when you're talking about character building things, when you're talking about a purpose that is more noble than how many likes you've got, then that requires a certain amount of time. It requires a certain amount of marination. You can't cook certain dishes in 2 minutes. It just doesn't happen. It needs a certain amount of absorption and introspection. So my sense is that this circle will also turn. One of the things that impresses me about some of the armies in the West is how the people laud the army. I was in an aircraft in the US a couple of years ago, and the pilot just announced that there's an ex-serviceman who's returning from Iraq, and the entire plane got up
wow.
to clap their hands, and each one of them went and met the soldier. in the US, servicemen, especially war veterans who are coming back from combat, are automatically upgraded. And there are cases where business class passengers will get up and give their seat because they recognize that. And that recognition is not because their soldiers are doing something exceptional. Their recognition is because their storytellers are telling that exceptional story exceptionally well.
Yeah.
So it's not the fault of the soldiers,
Sure.
it's the fault of the storytellers.
Yeah.
And I think we need more storytellers to take ownership of an amazing story and tell it really well to the remaining people.
I was particularly amazed by, I think, a story that you narrated in the past, which is about, you know, how do you get the army or soldiers to identify your enemy, right? And there was a great innovation, I thought, the way with the deck of cards. If you could just, you know, explain what was the need to do it.
So I think the armed forces are the ultimate champions of Jugaad.
Sure.
And we have to be,
Yeah.
because when you are thrown out of a plane and you're landing with just your gear, you pretty much have to innovate everything. And this is an amazing story in 2003 when the Allied soldiers, the American and the British and the Allied coalition was in Iraq, and they had managed to defeat Saddam Hussein's army, but they still had to capture him and they had to look for him. And how do you train 200, 300,000 soldiers to recognize your enemy facially, and not only recognize the enemy but also recognize the org structure, recognize the hierarchies? How do you do that? And you have to do it in an extremely short period of time. And in 2003, you didn't have tablets and smartphones and all of that. And they came up with this really innovative solution to it. And when you think about it, what do soldiers do most of the time when they're not killing? They're killing time. So they are mostly playing cards. And what they did was that they took the entire structure of the Iraqi Republican Guard and Saddam Hussein, his sons, his key lieutenants, and his key financiers and generals, and put them on a pack of cards. Now what's happening is when the soldiers are playing cards, they're recognizing the pictures there, and not only are they recognizing the pictures, but they're also recognizing the hierarchies. They
Pecking
know that
order, yeah.
exactly, the pecking order. They know the ace of spades is more important than the three of clubs, and so they recognize the entire org structure. And this is happening using airtime, prime time, which is already there, because they're already playing the cards.
Wow,
and
that's some serious innovation.
Yeah. And by the way, this is not a unique one, and this is not an innovation. This is an adaptation because it was used in the Second World War to train soldiers of how to recognize enemy aircraft. So if you have to train soldiers that this is not our aircraft, this is the enemy's aircraft, so you need to take cover, you can show them by slideshow or pictures, or you can put the pictures on cards. Now they recognize from the cards the silhouettes of the enemy planes, and the same idea was morphed to make them. So it's when you are strained with resources, you have to make do, and when you have to make do, creativity actually flourishes.
I think you're the right man to also talk about ISIS and, you know, its sudden growth, right? I mean, we saw that organization come from nowhere, and, you know, all we heard of was Al Qaeda, and now ISIS is taking over the world. Give me a sense of, you know, is enough being done to tackle ISIS? Are people tackling it the right way? Is it going to become bigger going forward? And are we entering, let's say, the dark years of the world?
We are entering a different world. We are entering an exponential world. So if forget about the ISIS for a moment. If you ask people if they heard about 3D printers 5 years ago or 10 years ago, most of them would say they hadn't heard about it.
Yeah.
But 3D printers have been around for the last 3 decades. The reason why you haven't heard about it was because the cost structures were so prohibitive that it was only a very small group of people who knew about it.
Okay.
Today what is happening is terrorism is being franchised. So it is not that one big monolithic terror organization which is headed by one leader like Prabhakaran, he controls the entire LTT. Today what's happening is that you have the core ideology which is being propagated, and then you are franchising the tools, the technology, the targeting, all of that, and you just need to go to Africa and start an organization called Boko Haram and just in brackets add AQ, and suddenly you're part of a Al-Qaeda network.
Oh, okay.
So in many ways what you're seeing is the exponential growth of anything. And this is an age where the nimble will always outmaneuver the
established,
dinosaurs, the established dinosaurs. And a good example of that is if you look at, and with no prejudice, if you look at a country which has the largest defense budget in the world. Matter of fact, the US has got it has a defense budget which is larger than the next 25 countries put together.
Sure.
Of which 23 are their allies, by the way. And that country wasn't able to stop leakages of their information getting across to the Chinese about their latest stealth fighters or their latest weaponry. That country wasn't able to close down the ISIS using YouTube, Facebook and Twitter to basically propagate and grow, and at least in the mind share. And that country had the biggest leak of classified data in the form of Edward Snowden. So money is not going to solve it. More resources is not going to solve it. Agility is going to solve it. And there is a lesson there. The ISIS is actually a metaphor for even corporates. When they will constantly keep looking towards the traditional enemy or the traditional competitor, in your space it's happening, like for your channel always would think about another channel as the competitor.
Yep.
But in the social media which is now maneuvering around, and you have citizen journalists who will report live from the situation way before your crew can get there.
Absolutely.
So the entire mindset of an exponential organization is focused on agility, focused on small teams, focused on much lower empowerment at the lowest level, who can take command decisions there and then on the spot, who don't have to ask their heads and say, can I do this, can I do that? So
I'm surprised I'm saying this or you're saying this, but basically what you're saying is they're much more evolved in their organizational structure.
They are, because they are evolved in pockets, they're evolved in decision making, they are using the media tools much more faster, much more effectively, and they have understood the human psyche much better. So for example, and I know it sounds a little macabre to say this, but if you ask a soldier and give him a choice that I'm going to kill you in 3 seconds or 5 seconds, or I'm going to torture you for 3 months and then kill you, the choice is pretty simple. And yet that 1 3-second video of slicing of the throat of a person, which goes viral in the internet space, is far more devastating and far more blood-curdling than movies about machine gunning people down or explosion or buildings falling and aircrafts falling and all of that. That element of psyche and the element of psychological warfare is something that the ISIS has mastered pretty well. The second lesson in ISIS is that no, ISIS didn't appear out of nowhere. No terror organization appears out of nowhere. Most of these organizations are the creations. So people wonder, where did ISIS suddenly spring up from? And there is an interesting backstory to that. So after the Second Gulf War, and when Iraq was subdued by the US, they created a camp called Camp Bucca, where they interned the Baath Party, the fundamentalists, and the Republican Army. Now, you basically created an academy. You put the ideologists along with the administrators, along with the sharp end of the stick, which is the army, and you interned them for 7 years, and then you rub your eyes and wonder, where did this ISIS come from? You actually created the academy for that. We at times actually don't learn from these mistakes. I'll give you an example. There's this, after the Nirbhaya rape case, there was this whole fervor in the society about punishing those 5 guys, and true enough, they should be punished, and I'm not, but there was also a huge campaign about lowering the age from 18 to 16. We've got to think through that. What we have effectively done is, we have now created an academy for criminals, because we are now going to take 16-year-old people, kids with impressionable minds, and throw them in the same jail where you have hardened criminals. And to survive in that pecking order, these kids will have to demonstrate how they stand apart from the crowd, how they are more vicious, how they are more better recruits to the seasoned criminals. So we are now taking an entire generation of 16-year-old kids and pushing them into jails, and perhaps creating the hardened criminals of the future. We actually set up an academy for them. So unless we think through some of these things and don't have a knee-jerk reaction to it, which is often what, you see something wrong happening and you want to immediately react to that, and usually it is ready, fire, aim. That's the sequence. You first become ready, then you fire, and then you think about aiming. And that's the way we react. I think it calls for a cool mind to think it through, think of the implications of what's going to happen. And that's true for ISIS, that is true for terrorism, that is true for business. Absolutely,
absolutely. Very well put. This has been absolutely enlightening. It's really my pleasure and my good fortune that I got to meet with you and do this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much for joining us on ET Now.
Thank you very much.